in your world, as a doctor involved with policy, stats, deep tissue research, being profoundly concerned about the veracity of your data, how do you humanize this? When you knock on the door of a mayor or a municipal manager, and those are just the official titles, right? You know as well as I do, if we can't humanize this stuff, we're not going to change the world with spreadsheets, right?
This is a critical question, but the most important part is really the policy dialogue that leads to the report. The way you have consulted the different stakeholders, built consensus on what are the main challenges or the ways forward, acknowledged and done justice to the efforts and the myriad of plans and responses and investments and support that was provided in response to the challenges that you identified, creating a coalition between public, private, non-profit stakeholders in a given city, in a given country, that can then make change happen once the OECD's work is completed. And I think for us, working with cities, there are three main ways that we have, let's say, adjusted and changed our work in the last decade in particular. The first one is acknowledging that governance is not just about governments, that even if we work on public policy, most of these public policies are, discharged across levels of government, but in cooperation with a broad range of stakeholders, including the private sector, civil society organizations, and require also behavioral change from citizens themselves. And therefore, if you do not include ex ante the myriad of players that are required to make the solution happen, then it remains a report that is on a shelf. The second starting point for us is to really provide a sort of neutral platform where we can have an open conversation, which requires countries and cities' readiness to open the books, in a transparent way, and neutralize somehow some of the sometimes very sensitive and politicized debates. Because the OECD comes as a third party. We're not an auditor. We're going to make evidence-based recommendations, suggest concrete actions, etc. But we're not going to put a fine on countries if they don't make this happen. We're not going to design sanction mechanisms. In the same way, we're not financing infrastructure. We have no vested interest, let's say, other than improve people's lives. And that third party, which creates the trust and helps put people around the table, is very important also to create an atmosphere where each of the stakeholders is part of the solution, trade-offs can be managed, and really consensus can be built. And then there's a third and last paradigm shift that I've seen in the last decade, which is that we are gradually shifting away from, maybe too detailed, lengthy, analytical work into things that are much more agile, action-oriented, and targeted. For example, we have developed a myriad of checklists, that are very user-friendly. We have gone extremely visual in our data sets so that end users can also play with them and do their own self-assessment, without the OECD necessarily coming and telling them how they perform. We are also setting a number of platforms, the champion mayors, for example, for inclusive growth that gathers the 60 world leaders that are making the fight against inequality a top priority, and doing a series of podcasts and other things that make this a bit more accessible, I would say, than maybe the traditional forms of outputs we were producing decades ago. So all this, in my view, goes in the right direction. You have the people, you have the outputs that are being revised, and you also have the process that is being adjusted to this demand.
So my question was, how do you humanize this? Okay, so you gave me 3 points. The first is really connect with everyone, right? Every relevant stakeholder, okay? We're using that very unhuman, if that's a term, unhuman term for referring to the people that matter, in a city, right? The second is keep it neutral and impartial. Make it clear that you've got no vested interest. You're not soliciting for anything. That's number 2. Number 3 is, instead of delivering mountains of paperwork and mountains of reports, you are delivering more agile, more visually compelling, more accessible pieces of work, which is perhaps accessible to a broader audience.